Hello, it's Matt McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and welcome to a very special series on living history. I'm really excited about this because July 1918 really marked the beginning of the end of the First World War. And like we've done in previous series, I wanted to take the opportunity to delve a little bit deeper into this than just a single episode. So we're going to do a whole special. We're going to do 4 episodes all about the so-called 100 days, the 100 days that ended the First World War in 1918. And joining me, I'm delighted to say once again in this special series, is the one and only Peter Hart. Pete, we're back, a new series. I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, me too. It's great to work with a professional. You know, some of the people I work with are not quite as. I'll say no more.
Surely you can't be referring to the one and only Gary Bain on your podcast, Pete and Gary's Military History.
No. Yes.
We'll skip past that quickly. Pete, we did our Gallipoli special, which was amazing and probably the most popular thing we've ever done on the podcast. It was so well received. And I came back to you and said I wanted to do another one. And the reason I've focused on this chapter of history, the really last half of 1918, is firstly, I think it's one of the most overlooked chapters of the entire First World War. But also, you wrote a fantastic book about it many years ago. And I'm not actually blowing sunshine up your ass when I say this, but I could not put it down. It was probably my favourite of all your books that I've read, of all 3 of your books that I've read. No, I've read more than that. No, but it was a great book. It was called 1918, A Very British Victory, I believe. And it was fantastic.
Well, and there was the last battle as well that was focused, funnily enough, just on these. So there's 2 of them.
There's 2 of them.
They breed, I think, books.
It's a great. It was a great book. I can't actually remember which one I read now. Could have been one or the other. I can't recall. It was a long time ago, but it's a great story. And I would encourage everyone to go out and grab either or both of those books because I think we owe it to these blokes that we're going to be talking about to tell their story. Because my experience from reading about it is for lots of them, this was some of the toughest fighting they experienced during the First World War. And we get so bogged down on the Battle of the Somme and Gallipoli and Passchendaele, we don't really think about what happened in the last half of 1918. And we have this preconception that the First World War sort of just chugged to inevitable conclusion, that, it was just the Germans were always going to lose, and eventually they did, and everyone just packed up and went home. But really, it couldn't be further from the truth. And just the tales of the fighting in this time, just really an extraordinary chapter of the war.
It is, and it's also the time which it frustrates historians because it's overlooked. People don't realise how good the British and French generals became in that last year of the war, and how they had everything thrown at them. They preferred to look at the Somme and Passchendaele, which were not generals' greatest hour, or they were certainly. It was a bloody business, and I just my view has always been you look at the sort of terrible, awful problems posed by the modern warfare, the inception of modern warfare in 1914, and you've got artillery. It's ruling the battlefield. There's layered trench lines by 1915. They've got the machine guns. They've got everything, and the massed artillery is the biggest problem. I don't think anyone could have done much better than the British and French generals did before 1918, if you like. Because when you look at a battle, there's two sides, aren't there? And we continually look at only one side. You look at our side, and our generals have failed. Our generals have done this, and our generals have done that. But actually, it's the Germans that are continually changing. Would you not agree? I mean, they are completely changing all the time. You're not saying?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, we talk about the Second World War as this huge technological advancement with jets and atomic bombs and everything else. But you look at the advancements of the First World War, and it was absolutely extraordinary how much things changed and how adaptable the generals became, the men on the ground became. And I think talking about the Second World War, this period of time is also coloured by the Nazi propaganda of the Second World War and the entire concept of that Germany was stabbed in the back during the First World War. That was a very big claim of the Nazis. It was kind of central to their rising in the 30s. And I can't remember who it was. I'm going to have to apologise. It was either Robin Pryor or Gary Sheffield, or probably both. But they wrote a fantastic article called "Stabbed in the Front" about the profound defeat of the German army in 1918, which is really what we're going to talk about now. And it was an absolute profound military defeat on the battlefield.
It was.
Of the First World War.
And people talk about the learning curve of Allied commanders, and they sort of, they a bit slow. You'd have thought they could have learned quicker. But actual fact, with the Germans involved, they're also changing. They're learning. And I like to think of it as being like a Big Dipper. So you go up as you learn, but then the Germans change something. They bring in extra lines or pillboxes or different defensive tactics. And then you go down the other side of the dipper. And it's a sort of up and down because it's two sides reacting to each other. And it's only in 1918 that actually the final swing of the fighting, that means that the Allies are on top. Perhaps we should start a little bit of comment about the German offensives in 1918. I mean, how would you regard them? They're a key part of the story, but we're not going to talk much about it. They precede what we're looking at, which is the so-called 100 Days. But what do you think of the German offensives? Yeah,
I mean, it was... it's a funny one because I think that they're often touted as the genius of the Germans on the battlefield, almost winning the war. I mean, I've been guilty of saying these things myself, but in reality, they shot their bolt, really, didn't they? In the first half of 1918, in the spring offensive, by the time they'd finished almost winning the war, in quote marks, they were effectively a broken army, and so the groundwork that led to the huge Allied victory really began to be laid in the spring of 1918 with the German spring offensives. That's how I'd put it.
And the thing we won't be talking about much about it is the imminent arrival of the Americans, of course, which is why the Germans had to win the war before high summer. But they didn't. And all their tactical genius, all it does is just give them dirty, great big salients that sort of demarcates, if you like. Is that a word? Anyway, show where they'd been. And all you end up is these salients, which are going nowhere. They don't take
It's a huge irony, isn't it, Pete, that the things that the Allies had been so constricted by in previous years, in the Somme and then especially in Ypres, in the salient, were these huge bulges sticking out into enemy lines, and that was all the Germans really managed to achieve. They pushed the Allies back in their spring offensives in March and April of 1918, but they didn't break through, and so they just created these huge, lengthy bulges in the line that were difficult to man and almost impossible to defend.
Now, one of the great things, of course, is that the sheer pressure of those assaults had led to the appointment of a single commander-in-chief. And that is incredibly important. And the man they chose was Ferdinand Foch. I like Foch. The old... It's obligatory to quote the business about... my left flank's giving away, my right flank's giving away, situation excellent, I shall attack, or whatever the exact quote is.
Is that how we pronounce his name, Pete? Foch? Because I've got a lot of French friends who pronounce it Foch.
fuck 'em.
Which I think can create difficulties in an English-speaking podcast.
It
So
just-
we will go with the more relaxed
Fosh,
anglicised version of Fosh.
Otherwise,
F-O-C-H.
You may already have to edit my recent remark there.
The thing I think is interesting, Pete, is we were talking about overlooked chapters of the war, which the second half of 1918 certainly is. But the French contribution in 1918 must count as completely overlooked from our Anglified position. And obviously with Foch being appointed, the French were a key ally. They were very heavily involved, and they were also doing a lot of fighting on the ground, weren't they?
Well, they were, because the final German offensive, they're aimed at the French. They are slamming into the French. But the French have learnt from the previous German offensives, and they're aware, they know what's coming, and they counterattack. 11th of June, they counterattack hard. They drive into one of the salients, one of the flanks. A new general, or new to the story that the British here, General Charles Mangin, and they're brilliant. They don't have a they introduce us to many of the concepts that would follow. There's no preliminary bombardment. There's a creeping barrage. We've heard of that, obviously, and the troops are supported by lots and lots of tanks and low-flying, strafing ground attack aircraft. And the French infantry, they seem to be back. They'd stuttered, if you like, in 1917 with the mutinies, but they are hitting a German army that's close to exhaustion. And what else is happening? So the Americans are on the march, and every week that passes, the Americans are getting more and more men to the front, and. So what does Ludendorff do? I mean, this is something you may or may not know. What does Ludendorff do?
Tell me, what does he do?
Oh, well, he's flailing, isn't he? He's flailing. He meant to launch his final masterstroke, Operation Hagen, against the British in Flanders, but it's postponed. So he's now desperate. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I can just imagine waving his hands in the air like an idiot, like me. And in desperation, he launches 3 German armies, 7th, 1st and 3rd, into the Friedenssturm, which the French call the Second Battle of the Marne, which is the key. To me, this is the beginning. That is the real beginning of the end. Because by this time, there's only the Germans have 207 divisions on the Western Front, but the Allies have 203. There's no bonus anymore from all those divisions coming back from the Eastern Front. That's gone. That's absolutely gone. They've been used up. There's no tactical surprise because all of the Allies understand the German tactics. And the German troops are beginning to be recycled through battles. They're getting to be what we call, in a technical term, knackered. And the French respond brilliantly. I mean, they do, don't they? I mean, the Second Battle of the Marne, how would you describe it, really?
Yeah, I mean, it was... The thing that I think is most notable here is intelligence operations as well. We cannot overstate how far the war had come in just a few short years, that intelligence was so important, and the French knew what to expect. So they were receiving this huge attack from the Germans, but they had a very clear indication of what was going on, and so they were able to counter as the Germans pushed against them. They had enough troops in the right places to hold up and advance. And I think that's something, Pete, that we're going to be talking about a lot. We're going to be talking about how developed the war had become by 1918. And this is laying the groundwork for what we would see in World War II. But it had come so far from 1914, and we're going to hear a lot about that. We're going to talk about tactical development. We're going to talk about the evolution of armies. And this was a perfect example. The French had intelligence working very effectively. They knew where the Germans were going to hit them. They could move troops and reinforcements to the correct areas. And the Germans were pretty well stymied.
Yeah, and the great beauty, of course, the command structure was Foch was part of this, and Foch asked for help from the British and got it. And when the Second Battle of the Marne begins, as the huge German bombardment on 15th of July, 1918, but the French defensive tactics work. They'd evacuated the front lines to dodge the bulk of the bombardment. They were ready with their own, and we often talk about this when we're in the pub. The French artillery actually opens up fire before the Germans had started their own barrage. They knew what was coming, and they smash into the German infantry in their jumping off trenches. And the result is a terrible defeat for the Germans. They couldn't get through the French forward zone, and when they did, they stopped dead at the second line, the battle zone, as they called it. The truth of it is, the Allies now know what to do, and the reserves, which includes French and obviously French, but includes American and British divisions, move up, and any German breakthrough stamped on, and then the counterstroke, because the French have amassed strong forces and they counterattack hard. And one of the biggest things is we always think of the British tanks, don't we? But there are other tanks in the First World War. What am I thinking of?
Well, the one of the greatest tanks of the First World War was the light Renault tank that the French put into action, and they put it into action here in a huge number. I think it was something like 750 tanks they had against the Germans at this time. Absolutely extraordinary. Pete, the thing I love about this chapter of 1918, and we're going to expand on this even more, is we have these cliches about the First World War, that it was always the Allies attacking against the cunning Germans, and then just when we thought we'd captured a trench, the Germans launched one of their famous counterattacks and drove us out. Look, that may have been the case in 1916, it may have been the case in 1917, but this illustrates by 1918, it had been turned on its head. The Germans were the ones throwing themselves against defences. The Germans were the ones running out of men and then having to face these huge counterattacks. And this is a perfect example, as the French 10th and 6th armies smashed into the Germans after the Germans had exhausted themselves against the defences.
Yeah, and they on the 18th of July, their counterattack, they actually advanced 4 miles, and this puts the French back on the front foot. The Germans being pushed back. 19th of July, there's another attack. The French 5th and 9th armies attack at the other side of the salient. And soon everybody's involved. French, British, American. Remember, American, they become, every day they're more important. And the whole of the ground lost in the German offensive, which had begun on the Aisne in 27th of May, is regained. Operation Hagen never happened because the Germans, Ludendorff realises the Germans are going to be thrust on the defensive for the foreseeable future. And this is why, and I think the French, those much maligned French, the cheese-eating surrender monkey. If anyone ever says that in my presence, I feel my hackles rise. The French won the Great War, essentially. They are the lead nation of 3 or 4 great nations who fought on the same side, and even allowing for the Russians who did their part. But the French, if anybody is in the lead, they are. It's them that begins the 100 days. But it's not 100 days, is it? It's 100. Maths with, well, not Pete and Gary, maths with Matt and Pete. I've no idea how many days it is.
Close enough to 100.
It's more than 100. 100 days.
I think that, Pete, the thing is, you and I are part of the new movement of historians to recognise the French. I mean, we've said this so many times in our discussions that the French get overlooked. And again, it's a hangover of the Second World War. Yes, it's true the French didn't perform as well as we might have liked them to in the Second World War, but even that is overblown. The French still fought pretty hard to defend their homeland in 1940. But we get this hangover of that effect, and especially an American position that the French didn't, they didn't fight hard enough, and they surrendered and they collaborated. We get all this noise from the Second World War, and then we just apply it to everything that the French ever did, including the First World War. And it's a slight on that fine nation. They did brilliantly in the First World War, and we ignored them far too much. So I'm glad we're addressing it here.
And that was a big point both of us wanted to address at the start of this. But let's turn to the British Army. What are they up to? What are they up to, Gary? What? I mean, what have Hagen...
Did you just call me Gary?
Yes. You look a bit like him. You've put a bit of weight on, Matt. You've just got to accept it. And that beard looks like Gary's stubble.
It's a shame people can't see what we're actually talking about here. But I mean,
come on, Matt.
Well, it's an evolution, isn't it? There's a huge change in the British Army between 1915 to 17, and it can be best summed up as the all arms battle. This probably overused term, but we are going to talk about it in reality here. The all arms battle of 1918, and there were just so many elements that had changed.
Give me some examples, Matt. Think of me as a child at your knee.
Well, I come back to the one thing I always come back to, and notwithstanding the fact that it's written in the notes, I also would have made the same point. But the infantry and firepower. This is a huge one of mine. Whenever I'm leading a tour on the battlefields and we talk about the 1918 battlefields, a huge part of the story is mobile firepower. We would recognise it today, and it's often been said, it's a cliche, that a Napoleonic soldier would have recognised the fighting of 1914, and a modern soldier would recognise the fighting of 1918. Little bit of a stretch, but I think the point is valid, and one of the huge keys here is mobile firepower. In 1914, 15, 16, when the soldiers are attacking, if they come across an unexpected German machine gun, the only thing they can do is charge it with their rifle and bayonet and hope for the best. By 1918, they've got mobile firepower. They've got Lewis guns. They've got Vickers guns. They've got trench mortars in close support. They've got rifle grenades. And they're able to make decisions on the ground. Small groups of men can make decisions about where they employ those resources to overcome strong points. So we've got a very heavily armed and a very mobile force that's given the flexibility to make its own decisions on the battlefield. So I think that's a huge one. A German machine gun in 1916 could hold up an entire company because there was just no way of taking it out. By 1918, 9, 10, 12 men in a platoon could overcome that strong point because of collective firepower.
Absolutely. And I always say, being able to fire 15 rounds a minute, you'll run out of ammunition pretty quickly. This is a 1914 soldiers, much vaunted, 15 rounds a minute. But what's the point? You're going to run out of ammunition. And it's nothing compared to a Lewis gun or a Vickers gun or a hand grenades, mortars. It's great. And it's not just them. You've got gas. You've got smoke barrages. You've smoke to hide you behind a smoke screen. And then, of course, you've got the tanks. Now, people always bang on about the tanks. But they are important. They break down a lot, but they're important because you can bring them up to deal with a pillbox or a machine gun.
Well, there's also an evolution in tanks at this point too, Pete, that we should point out, that this was not how the British, when they invented the tank, originally expected them to be used. The reason First World War tanks are that strange rhombozoid shape is because the expectation was they would cross a trench, they would crush the barbed wire, stop on top of a trench, and then the reason the guns are on the side is so they could fire along the trench in both directions. They were used for breaking trenches. But in 1918, we discovered another and much more effective use for them, which is how tanks would be used, for the rest of warfare, which is as close infantry support. Mobile artillery, mobile machine guns that could follow the infantry or lead the infantry into an attack and deal with unexpected strong points. And that's when things like the Renault tank become so important in these battles, because they could move fast. And the Whippet, the British Whippet tank, because they could move fast. They were fast moving, and even the Mark 4 and 5 tanks were slow moving. Relatively, but even the Mark 4 and 5 tanks were still only going at walking pace by this time. So something that could go a bit quicker than walking pace was vital, which is where the light tanks came in.
What about cavalry? Are they gone from the battlefield? Because I don't think they are.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's always you talk about the much maligned cavalry. It's always the slur directed at Haig that he was too obsessed with cavalry. But at the end of the day, they're the only fast-moving unit on the battlefield. If you have a breakthrough, and as long as you haven't got machine guns trained on that gap, I tell you what, the cavalry can get through in a hurry, and they can cause a lot of mayhem behind the lines, as they did during the fighting in 1918, in numerous examples.
Haig reckoned when the Germans nearly broke through in 1918, if they'd had their cavalry instead of they were rampaging around the Eastern Front trying to hold ground and seize resources, that they would have done a lot better. You're so right. If you've got infantry in retreat because there's been a breakthrough, the absolute number one weapon you could employ against them is a fast-moving men on horses. They would absolutely have cut through infantry in a rout, as we saw it several times. So there was a role for cavalry, and as we shall see as we go along, we'll touch on a little bit, but there were times when the cavalry became absolutely essential components on the battlefield. And aircraft, in 1914...
Cavalry of the skies.
Oh, God. Any cliche in the floor. But they're string bags in 1914. People say they're primitive. They're not primitive. They're advanced modern weapons of the time. But they look primitive. By 1918, they're fast-moving. They're not just photographing or carrying out artillery observation. They're strafing and bombing. They're actually diving down and intervening in the battle.
And this wasn't what we were talking about earlier in the war, when, Gallipoli, when they were bombing, in quote marks, it would be a bloke leading out of the cockpit holding a bomb in his hand, which he'd do his best to aim. That by 1918, They had proper aiming systems. They had machine guns that could fire on the ground. And it was a terrifying weapon to have aircraft ripping out of the sky and tearing into you with bombs and machine guns.
Probably not the most terrifying part of the all-arms battle, though. I think there's one thing that is the most terrifying, murderous, just weapons system, and that's the artillery, isn't it?
Always. We can't tell the story of the First World War without talking about artillery.
They're the supreme weapon system, and it's not just shrapnel. It's high explosive. It's gas shells, which is the main method of delivering gas. They control the battlefield. You can't win without them, and you could deluge a battery of German guns. You identify it through the Royal Flying Corps, and then you deluge them with gas shells, and they can't do anything, can they?
We're going to talk a lot about the artillery and the roles that they play in 1918 because it's so important. Peter, philosophical question I wanted to ask you. I assume all of this stuff just evolved on its own, that there was no one at the top actually directing this or noting the results. I assume it was just the plucky Tommy on his own came up with this concept. Was that the case?
In the words of Plato, was it bollocks? The point about this, and it wasn't Monash either, or Curry, or Haig. It was the British Army. It is actually the much maligned staff officers. They are responsible. There's a systematic analysis of after-action reports, which are then worked up into the SS pamphlets. Unfortunate name to the modern ear, but the Second World War hadn't happened. And the training pamphlets are very detailed. How to do this, how to do an attack, how to use artillery, how to use this, how to use Lewis guns in action, and they provide a how to do it. Inarticulate Pete, they used to call me. They show you exactly how to do things. And this is disseminated not just through the Australian Corps or the Canadian Corps, no disrespect to those fine bodies of men, but through the whole British Army. It's not one man responsible. It is a systematic thing. If there's one man responsible, it's Haig, but only because he's at the top, and he is the man who provides the focus and allocates the resources to this kind of thing. That is, and if it's not, and if you're listening to this, and you get a chance to read one of those pamphlets, the SS series, please do, because they're fascinating reading, and they straight away break down this myth about the generals not knowing what they were doing. But it's just fascinating reading, and the thing I always love about them, Pete, is how honest they are. They talk about, oh, this worked, but they'll also talk about, oh, this didn't work at all. We tried to do X, Y, and Z. We tried, putting the tanks in front of the infantry without an adequate artillery support, and they got the hell blown out of them. So they're very frank in terms of what went wrong as well. So what you're getting is, as you said, it's a complete how-to-do pamphlet, and that's what it was designed for the next general to read and to plan the next attack. Brilliant. So we're in agreement, thank goodness. Now, so what's the situation in 1918? Well, the German army, at its high command, its men on the ground, they're all, the nation as a whole, they'd come to a conclusion that the war was as good as lost. Now, one sign of this was uncovered by one of our favourites, and we are going to emphasise the Australian role because why shouldn't we? We've got to emphasise somebody's, and you're Australian. The Australian Corps are part of this. They have a tactic of raiding. They always do it. They raid, they patrol, and they expose the developing German weaknesses. Now, you've got a quote, haven't you? Who are you going to tell us? A well-known source, I'm sure familiar to you from his book, Jacka's Mob. Brilliant book. Yeah, it's a great book, and we've touched on him before. It's Lieutenant Edgar Rule, and he's describing here what the Australians referred to as peaceful penetration. Penetration meaning penetrating the German lines, just to be clear, listeners. But there was absolutely nothing peaceful about this. It's a complete misnomer. That they killed scores of Germans in these raids. It was violent. It was savage. And I like this quote from Edgar Rule because it illustrates what was actually happening in the German army. And the German army of 1918 was not the German army that had proceeded into France in 1914. So this is what Lieutenant Edgar Rule of the 14th Battalion had to say after one of these raids. These Huns belonged to a second-rate division and were very peaceable. No matter how our boys annoyed them, they never retaliated. And of course, we heaped it on thicker. What with trench mortars and bombs, the enemy's life was one long hell. It just shows up. By the way, can I congratulate you on your brilliant Australian accent? I'm used
thanks,
to
mate. I've
working
been practicing. I was up all night practicing. I wanted to get it right. Gary
Really?
gave me some lessons, and I went
Gary's
from there.
great at Australian accents.
Anyone who hasn't heard Pete and Gary on Pete and Gary's Military History, do yourself a favour and listen to it, and especially the accents. It's always a hype for everyone. Anyone that listens to that podcast loves the accents.
Especially for the people
Gary's
who complain
Australian is
about
no exception. Your Scottish is always good too, Pete. I have to say.
Now, right, back to work. So now the Australians are the Australian Corps. They're not an independent command. They're part of 4th Army, or at this point, under General Sir William Rawlinson. And he decides to test the water to see. He's getting these reports coming in, and the person he puts in charge of this is responsible for the attack is, and I know you know more about this attack than me, is Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, commanding the Australian Corps, but very much helped and assisted in planning by someone who you might not have, you will have heard of, but a lot of people won't. Brigadier General Anthony Courage of 5th Brigade.
Great name. What a great name.
Yeah, but not an Australian.
He's British. And I'm just going to preempt here to say, Pete, for our Australian listeners, we are going to talk here about the Battle of Hamel briefly, considered by many Australians to be one of the finest actions. But I think it's interesting what we're doing here is we're going to put it in context. We're going to talk about it, and what a great success it absolutely was. But by the time you get to the end of this podcast, you will see that in the big scheme of what was happening late in 1918, it was a relatively small action.
It was, yeah. It's basically a local attack to straighten the line round Hamel. And I've been on the battlefield. I remember being on the battlefield with you and with one of your tours, and it's interesting. The battle commenced 03:10. That's very early in the morning. On the 4th of July, 1918.
You'd just be getting home from the pub, Pete.
No, not anymore. The old days, those happy days. But it's a great success. The German troops in the area are just swept aside. I think the British heavy artillery plays a crucial role. It silences the German guns. The field artillery, that chaperones the advancing infantry and tanks right up to and over the German defences. And and they deal with any pockets of resistance. Amidst this, the village of Hamels are captured, and there's an overall advance of around 2,000 yards, which is no mean thing for a local attack. And again, you're going to tell us what Lieutenant Edgar Rule of the 14th Australian Battalion says.
So Edgar Rule said, as we got to our objective, we found 2 dugouts. I happened to be there first, and I heard movement in one of these shelters. When I yelled out to the occupants, out came 2 hands with a loaf of black bread in each, and presently a pair of terrified eyes took a glimpse at me. They must have been reassured by my look, because the Huns came out at once, and when I sized them up, all thoughts of revenge vanished. Revenge vanished. We could not kill children, and these looked to be barely that. If any of us had been asked how old they were, most of us would have said between 14 and 15, and that was giving them every day of their age. With a boot to help them along, they ran with their hands above their heads back to our lines. And Pete, doesn't that sum up what we were saying about the state of the German army in 1918? They were desperate. They were calling in everyone they could.
But a nice bit of humanity as well from Edgar Rule,
absolutely.
To not just kill them all. The Germans they do surrender en masse, and those, if they didn't, they were killed or wounded. Allied casualties 1,000. The Germans lost best part of 2,500, and that's good odds. For an attack,
most of those as prisoners, we should say. By far the majority of German casualties in that attack were prisoners, and this is a trend that will continue for the rest of 1918.
Now, perhaps you'd like to sum up this successful template, because it's best it comes from an Australian voice, or they'll just say it's me being me again.
No, and again, this is to take nothing away from the Australians, nothing away from the Monash. No. From Monash, what we're trying to do is put this in context, that there was a big Allied cooperative endeavour going on, and Hamel made up part of it. Now, it was a test case. They did want to see, would this work, putting in tanks in this way and supported by aircraft and smoke barrages and gas shells and infantry advances in a particular way. It absolutely was a test case, but because it was small, it could be used as a test case. It was small, it was an isolated part of the battlefield, so they could assess these tactics. And so it did work very, very well, and Monash did... he didn't come up with these ideas, but he did put them together very well. And when we're on the battlefields, what I say to people, I say this at the battlefield of Hamel, which is an incredible battlefield to visit, because you can see you can see exactly where things went on. And actually, a lot of our tours with the army, we go to Hamel for that reason, because you can look at it like a map. And what I say to people is Monash before the war was an engineer, and if he built a bridge, he wasn't down there working out new ways to mortar bricks together. He was collaborating. He was absorbing information. He was reading reports from London about new ways that they built bridges, and something from New York, and he was talking to people and bringing all this information together. He was a genius, but he was a genius at aggregating information and then finding good ways to apply it. So Monash wasn't out there walking along with a rifle and bayonet working out a better way for the infantry to go. He wasn't riding in a tank coming up with new tactics, but he was speaking to his tank commanders. He was discussing ways of doing things with the infantry and coming up with interesting new ways of putting things together, as was the British Army as a whole, it must be said. This was a great time of evolution and innovation, and Monash was definitely at the forefront, but he didn't invent these tactics that were applied at Hamel.
Yeah, and it was a great success, and all credit to Monash for this. I mean, now Rawlinson, his commander, was really encouraged, and you can imagine it, and he looks to take advantage of the perceived and evident German weakness in the whole Somme area. He couldn't resist it. It's too much of a temptation. And he starts to plan for the Battle of Amiens. And his initial plans for Fourth Army, his army, to attack in 3 stages. Firstly, overrun the German front line, get about 2,500 yards deep. Second, there'd be fresh divisions leapfrogging in to get a further 3,000 yards forward. And the third stage, after a little bit of a pause, resty, to allow them to push forward and capture the old outer Amiens defence line. And then consolidation and sort out the flanks and thing. And Haig accepts this, doesn't it? But Foch intervenes. Now, what does Foch say? Because that's quite interesting to show that Haig isn't in command now. In the end, by consent, but Foch is in command. What does Foch do?
Foch wanted a much bigger operation. He wanted the French to get involved as well. He also sensed that the Germans were weak, and he wanted the French involved in what was going to be one of the most important attacks of the war. And can I just stop there, Pete? We can gloss over it quickly, but the distance they were supposed to be capturing, 2,500 yards in the first stage, 3,000 in the next, and then another big advance to capture that final line. I mean, we just finished our Gallipoli podcast talking about the battles of Krithia, where they considered it was successful if they'd advanced 300 or 400 yards. We're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of yards. And again, it blows that myth out of the water that the First World War was defined by trenches and stalemate. This one-day attack is going to push that aside. So the French are going to be heavily involved as well at the insistence of Foch.
And the French First Army is actually put, again, inter-allied cooperation. It's put under Haig's overall command. It's really important. There's something else that's important. And I'll just ask you a question. Is Cambrai the biggest tank battle of the war?
No, it is not. No, it is not, Peter.
God, blimey.
The numbers of tanks here. Tanks were going to be essential in this advance. I think you're right. Tanks get a little bit overplayed in our discussion of how the war was won. I think artillery was a lot more important, but I got to say, they weren't taking any chances with the number of tanks they put in here. I mean, we've got the numbers here. 324 heavy tanks, 96 light whippet tanks, and, again, important, 120 supply tanks. And now I read a statistic that said a supply tank could carry as many supplies as 1,200 men. Like, these are extraordinary quantities of stuff that's being brought forward in these supply tanks. That's essential. Armies don't just fight. They need to be reinforced. They need to be resupplied. Supply tanks are essential. Yeah,
and supply tanks add to the logistical framework, something new. And you're right, they could take... all those hand grenades, all that ammunition could be took forward in relative safety. Although when they were hit, they did go bang.
You know what? Nothing in this, when we talk about tanks, nothing in this suggests that either of us would want to actually be in those tanks. But in terms of what they achieved on the battlefield, it was really, really quite important. But we're not going to linger too long on the tanks because, once again, what does it come back to, Pete? It comes back to the artillery. And this was absolutely extraordinary. This was the thing that won the First World War.
It is, and they move up the guns, thousands of guns. The logistical thing is not just moving the guns, but the ammunition. They also have to, and this is all part of the developing thing. Every gun is tested calibrated on the ranges so that the gun sights are accurately performing their role, because it's really important. And they're tested again. They're using I can't say this word, meteorological. Oh, that's not bad. Meteorological readings, because shells go at a different rate through different atmospheres. Happy atmosphere, yeah.
But we can't overstate again the importance of not having to register the guns. In previous battles, the guns had to fire many rounds to make sure they were hitting the target, and that gave the Germans ample warning that an attack was coming. By this stage, the guns were all opening up without any pre-registration, and just this hurricane bombardment was just landing on the Germans from out of nowhere.
Brilliant. And they've located through flash spotting. Well, the Royal Flying Corps, firstly. Hang on. It's the RAF at this point. They've changed on the 1st of April. The RAF, then there's flash spotting, there's sound ranging, there's all sorts of things. Every German battery's been identified, and they are vulnerable to being taken out when the barrage opens.
How important is this? The idea of counter battery fire, of artillery not just firing on troops and not just firing on trenches. How important is this concept of counter battery fire where artillery is firing on the enemy's artillery?
It's absolutely crucial. And what goes wrong on the Somme, amongst many other things, is the absence of counter-battery fire. They thought they'd put enough guns on it. They hadn't. And although we think of machine guns causing the damage on the Somme, just as much damage is caused by those unsuppressed batteries of 5.9-inch guns for the Germans opening up when the troops are in their own lines, when they're crossing no man's land, when they're retreating. And artillery is the biggest killer of the war. And if you can take out the German guns before the battle starts, or as it starts, in the same moment, it's incredibly important.
And we're talking collaboration here, aren't we, Pete? Because we had, as you mentioned, we had the RAF doing brilliant work spotting camouflage positions. We had sound ranging teams who were listening out. They had complicated equipment to actually hear the sound of enemy flashes.
Can you explain how sound ranging works, Matt?
Yeah, you have a microphone and you listen to it, and then people much smarter than me work out where the guns are. Triangulation and many learned fellows with maps and pencils and protractors, no doubt.
I don't understand it either, but I understand.
But flash spotting was a big thing as well.
Yeah. You have observation. You see a flash, and you get two lines from two different places, and where they cross is where the gun is. I understand that.
And new types of fuses as well were really important. I can't remember, it was the Mark 18 or something. Fuse was really important. High explosive shells. That's it.
108.
Yeah, you're better with your numbers than I am. But there was just so much coming together. We can't overemphasize. I keep saying that word, but we can't overemphasize how much was coming together at this time.
Yeah.
And what an effect it had, Pete. I mean, the Germans had, I think it was something like 530 guns in the immediate area. How many of them were identified?
3. 504. I mean,
504 out of 530 were correctly identified.
Maths with Pete and Matt. That's only 26 unidentified.
It's just unbelievable. And if they know where the guns are, they know where the gun. What does this combination mean? They know where the guns are, and they've got this incredible new technique to fire accurately without having to pre-register. Those German gunners were not going to play much of a role in that battle at all, because they were going to be under a deluge of shell fire and gas, which was going to take them out. Extraordinary.
We had, they had 530 guns. We had 1,386 field guns and howitzers, and 684 heavy artillery pieces. And they're the ones that take out, if there are bunkers, there's not that many in this area, but they're the ones that take out deep dugouts and bunkers, and they are amazing. They've got plenty of shells, 500, 600, heavier ones, 400. They've got enough guns not only to saturate the German batteries, the counter-battery fire, but also to provide an absolutely stunning creeping barrage moving just in front of the troops to keep the Germans' heads down, but more than that, to kill them, suppress their ability to fire.
I discovered this during my work on my recent Gallipoli book called Krithia, out now. Is brilliant. The word barrage is a French word, and it's the same word that means barrier. So the word barrage was first used in 1915, and what it actually means is not a massive, explosive effect like we think it means. What it means is a wall. Barrage means a barrier of shells. And that's what a creeping barrage is. It's a wall of lead that stops the Germans from getting at the infantry.
Yeah, and it's become a bit of a formula, really. You have so many. It's just worked out. Given number of batteries, frontage trenches, divide by 2, add the number you first thought of, is not the formula. But the point is, they were making these calculations, and it's becoming a brutalistic and mechanistic. It's not romantic or heroic, is it? But it is war. And the Royal Artillery by this time really is bloody well ready for war. It's got everything it needs.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
So, Pete, we've got artillery working well, we've got tanks, we've got aircraft. Surely that's all you need to win the war. Was there any other vital ingredient in the formula?
Well, you should never forget the central figure, should you? And I know you haven't. We both know who. At the centre is the soldier, the infantry soldier. And it's a humble resource in some people's opinion. And I always like to think of Gary at this point. A sweating, farting, moaning, cursing anachronism, you might say. It's not an anachronism. It isn't to this day. They're utterly irreplaceable, even in a sort of mechanical war like it's become in 1918. They are irreplaceable. They're the ones who have to actually capture, occupy and retain an object. Can a tank? It can capture. Can it occupy and retain?
But it can't hold it. It can't hold it. A tank can capture ground, but it can't hold it. That's where you need a bloke with a rifle, and especially in 1918.
And the tactics have moved on as well. I mean, if you imagine, although it actually is a more complex picture than this, and actually Robin Pryor did a lot of work on this. The first day of the Somme isn't just lines of infantry advancing. It's more complex than that. But that's how we see it, and that's how it certainly was in places in the British line. But it's moved on a lot now. It's moved on. They have advanced scouts pushing forward about 150 yards forward. They're close to the tanks and just behind the creeping barrage. With Australians and Canadians, they're often almost in it.
It's a clever tactic, isn't it? Because you've got these scouts going forward in conjunction with the tanks, and you're a German machine gunner who's survived the initial barrage. What are you going to do? If you have to take out the scouts, but as soon as you do, you expose your position to the tanks. So it's actually a really clever tactic without exposing thousands of men to machine gun fire. It's brilliant.
And behind them would come the main body of a battalion, say. And they're not, they're attacking a 2-company front, but the men are strung out now. And they're not in lines, it's always called worms. So 6 or 8 men moving forward in single file with about 30 to 60, 50, 60 yards between each worm. Not an easy target. And the platoon, the section has become a key part of command structure. Corporals are often leading, taking. It's all to minimise the effects of being caught in the open. Although you've already, with your artillery barrage, suppressed the German ability to fire, and then But the supporting battalions will just march forward in artillery.
And we do hear this
formation.
in accounts. We do hear this in accounts of the guys moving forward at this time, surprised by the lack of artillery fire coming from the Germans.
Absolutely.
You read it time and time again that compared to previous actions, there was a decided lack of artillery fire coming at them. So it worked. The counter battery fire worked.
Now, Haig selects, the British Army doesn't have the same corps in each army, so Haig switches his corps about. And the Fourth Army, in amongst it, were the Australian Corps and the Canadian Corps. Now, these are the benchmark of quality on the Western Front. There are other units as good, but they are a benchmark. They show the level that can be achieved. I've got nothing but respect for both of them. But there are a couple of points that I think, in fairness, we have to make. This isn't making excuses for the British or anything else, but they've been carefully husbanded, haven't they, by Haig? What's he done?
Well, yeah, Haig, particularly the Canadians, but also the Australians to a lesser extent, he recognised that they were going to be his attack force. And one of the big things, and I always say to people when we talk about the first half of 1918, is the Canadians and the Australians weren't in the line to face the massive German spring offensive. So the poor old British units that were in the line having to defend against the Germans, by the time we're talking July and August 1918, those units have been fighting for months. And they were pretty knocked around. The Australians and Canadians were involved very heavily in counterattacks to stop the German spring offensive, but they didn't have to face the brunt of the Germans on the 21st of March when the Germans almost broke through. So the Canadians and the Australians had been handpicked as the assault forces for future attacks, and they, as you say, they'd been husbanded. They'd been kept out of the dangerous sectors of the line, and they hadn't been wasted in little piecemeal operations.
And they'd maintained their old structure. All the British divisions used to have 12 battalions. Now, the British divisions are down to 9 battalions, which is the same as the Germans. It's not a bad thing, but it's a good thing that the Australians and Canadians were still at 12 battalions, and that makes a difference.
And we should also add here, Pete, that those 12 battalions were almost entirely fighting combat infantry. I know there were artillery units and trench mortars and things, but the bulk were fighting troops. Whereas the British, of course, had to supply all of the support, everything that went with keeping an army moving. The colonial, divisions, as we will call them, could dedicate themselves to becoming elite fighting forces because they didn't have to do anything else. It was the poor old Brits supporting them.
Now, so you can imagine from the German perspective, oh, hello, the Australians are opposite us, which they were on the Somme. Oh, hello. Oh, hello. The Canadians. You know there's going to be an attack. But there was a lot. By this time, the British Army is becoming pretty clever. And they're down Ypres way. And there's a lot of subterfuge, a lot of Second World War style before D-Day, a lot of operations to fool the Germans, intelligence operations. So they leave a couple of Canadian battalions. They leave casualty clearing stations. Most of all, they leave a wireless section to send out loads of misleading wireless things. All things that we recognise from the recent celebration of D-Day. That's all the sort of thing that was done. And the real move is delayed until the last. But they don't actually get to the jumping off lines until 2 hours before 0 hour. And this is a sign of the sophistication of the planning, not of Haig. This is the staff officers. Haig is just that. When I say figurehead, I don't mean that he's just this bumbling idiot at the top, but he is like you, the chief executive of a mighty company, directing thousands of in your touring firm. He's like that, and you're laughing for some reason.
I wish.
So, the Germans are fooled. That's the point I'm making. The Germans are completely fooled. Now, there's another thing. What else is very recognisable to us from things like D-Day? And it's secrecy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's no good having these plans. And the fact that the Canadians were only getting into the lines 2 hours before 0 hour, that's not because they were rushed. They knew exactly what they were doing and where they were supposed to be because the plans were incredibly intricate. And the information was very well disseminated. Everyone knew exactly where they had to be. Everyone was trained and briefed, and they knew where they had to be. So they could come into the line 2 hours before and still know what they were doing. But all of this would come to nothing if there wasn't secrecy. The Germans had to be fooled. It had to be a surprise. And that was something that was absolutely essential. And perhaps they didn't recognise that earlier in the war and didn't pay enough attention to the value of secrecy. Again, we've been talking about Gallipoli. The soldiers, months before they arrived at Gallipoli, were told, you're off to Gallipoli. You know, they did not value the importance of secrecy, but by 1918 they certainly did. And I think, Pete, you've got a quote which illustrates that better than anything.
Well, it's from the orders, from Rawlinson's orders. It says this: keep your mouths shut. The success of any operation we carry out depends chiefly on surprise. Do not talk. When you know that your unit has been making preparations for an attack, don't talk about them to men in other units or to strangers, and keep your mouth shut, especially in public places. Do not be inquisitive about what other units are doing. If you hear or see anything, keep it to yourselves. The success of the operation and the lives of your comrades depend on your silence. And that is different. They'd had secrecy before, but not at this level of and also the understanding that you have to disseminate it. It's not just a headquarters thing. Every man in the army has to understand it.
And I thought the most interesting thing to me there, Pete, was do not be inquisitive about what other units are doing, because that's what men do. They run into their old mate that they used to serve with a year ago, and they say, oh, what are you up to? We're training here in, we're going to do a big push against Harbonnier. What are you up to? And all of a sudden, it's not secret anymore, and the word is spreading. And it's a fascinating order, that one.
Now, the Battle of Amiens is coming up. It's going to start on the 8th of August. On manpower, let's look at the two sides facing each other. It's going to be a titanic battle, if you like. Numerically, they're roughly speaking the same size, but there's more. There's hidden. If you count the number of divisions, they're the same size. That's what I meant. They're not, because the German divisions, some of them are down to 3,000, 4,000 men. They've been fighting. They've been in these offensives. They've been chewed up, and there's a numerical superiority of say 3 to 2. Now that's. My mind has once again got back to the 1st of July, because it was many more than that then, wasn't it? It was more like 10 to 1. What happened on the 1st of July?
And we always talk about 3 to 1 attack versus defence. So 3 to 2 isn't quite as good as you would imagine it to have been, but it's going to be different this time.
Well, the other thing is that the Germans, they're not themselves. They haven't really sorted out the defence system. This is not. Don't imagine the Hindenburg Line. We'll be imagining that in one of our later podcasts. Don't imagine even the trenches on the Somme in 1916. This is just ramshackle trenches with bits and bobs of barbed wire. It might have stopped the British Army in 1916, or certainly in 14, but it's not going to stand up against the whirlwind, that the actual sort of Gotterdammerung of the all-arms offensive. There's
two things coming together at once, aren't there, Pete? Is that in 1916, the Battle of the Somme that we always come back to, we had really, really strong positions that the Germans had 2 years to create, and pretty average tactics to try and overcome them. It was basically just put as many men as you can in and hope for the best. Now we've got the opposite occurring. The Germans have been falling back. They're exhausted. Their defence is somewhat improvised at this stage, so we don't have these strong fixed positions. But in addition, we've got incredible tactics. We've got these all-armed tactics which are going to shock and awe anyone they come up against. So it's two things colliding at once, which means the Germans are in a bit of a pickle.
Buggered, I would have said.
So 8th of August 1918.
Oh, the day. And the Royal Artillery, the guns blare out in solid unison at 0 hour, 4:20 in the morning, very early. And this is what Gunner Bertie Cox, 60th Field Battery, 5th Canadian Division, says. I'm not going to do an accent because I cannot do a Canadian accent. Every gun shot together and the thing was off. I never heard anything like it in my life. Neither has anyone else, as it was about the biggest show that has ever been staged on the Western Front. Several times I could not hear my own gun fire, and for half the series I laid and fired the gun myself. After 3 hours I was practically deaf. We fired our first shot at 4:20 a.m. at 800 yards, and in 3 hours the enemy was out of range, 6,500 yards. Within 10 minutes of the start, the tanks by the hundreds and cavalry by the thousands were passing our guns. It made an awfully pretty picture to see the tanks and cavalry looming up in the mist over their crest just about dawn. The field guns began to pass us at a gallop, not to mention the infantry by the hundreds of thousands. Now, he's overexcited, he's exaggerating. And by the way, everybody always says that every barrage is the biggest they've ever heard on the Western Front. But there's some truth in it. This is a bloody big barrage.
He certainly wasn't exaggerating about the measurements, and that demonstrates how well the attack was going. They started firing at a range of only 800 yards, and within 3 hours, their guns were firing at maximum range, which was 6,500. The only reason that's occurring is the Allied infantry are moving forward. So that's a perfect illustration there. And the guns are now out of range of the infantry. The infantry has outranged their guns. Just an extraordinary advance.
We've learned, so we've made arrangements to move guns up. And you hear he's mentioned the guns are moving. They start moving the field artillery. In fact, some field artillery are moving with the infantry. It's amazing. It's a distillation, this barrage, of everything that's been learnt by the Royal Artillery, by the British Army, by the Australian Corps in the war. And you're going to be someone very distinguished. You're going to tell us what Lieutenant General Sir John Monash of the Australian Corps says.
Well, Monash had to say, "And suddenly, with a mighty roar, more than 1,000 guns began the symphony. A great illumination lights up the eastern horizon, and instantly the whole complex organisation, extending far back to areas almost beyond earshot of the guns, begins to move forward. Every man, every unit, every vehicle, and every tank on the appointed tasks and to the designated goals, sweeping on relentlessly and irresistibly. Viewed from a high vantage point and in the glimmer of the breaking day, a great artillery barrage surely surpasses in dynamic splendour any other manifestation of collective human effort." Pete, I'm getting excited reading. Imagine, just these descriptions, the artillery blasting away, the thousands of men and tanks moving forward, the guns raising as the infantry advances. God only knows what it was like for the poor Germans under facing that barrage.
Now, one of those men who moved forward behind the creeping barrage is Corporal William Kerr, 5th Western Cavalry Battalion, 1st Canadian Division. This is what he says. "Then we were over the tape and away, me with my Lewis gun section, off along with the tanks. But it was off in a fog as well, a fog that had been coming down all night. It was now so thick you could hardly see 20 yards in front of you. The tanks, unless one came very near to you, you could only place by sound. It was an eerie start. No time, Germans, ghost-like it. In no time, how to read. In no time, Germans, ghost-like in the mists, were showing up all over the place, most with their hands up above their heads in surrender. But here and there, a machine gun still firing at random at us, but not aimed." That's interesting. At random. But that gives you it all away. There's still easy targets, aren't there, as they're crossing no man's land? But what isn't there? What isn't there? German counter-barrage. Where's the German guns? Well, they're busy. They're busy dying and being suppressed. Suppressed is a great word, isn't it? Suppressed. Our ability fire was suppressed by the fact that we were trying to put our gas master on and we were surrounded by British shells everywhere.
I've seen you suppressed by a hangover on more than one occasion, Pete.
No, that was the past. I'm very old now.
I think it's interesting, though, too, Pete, but seriously, talking about this, the Germans, without their counter-battery fire, had no answer to the tanks, did they? There were no German tanks at this stage. I mean, the Germans only made 20 in the whole war. There were no German tanks. They had nothing to counter them with. There's a fantastic photo taken from about this time, not on the first day, but during this era, showing Germans, as a German photo taken from behind a German trench, showing tanks, British tanks advancing towards them. I don't know if you've seen it, Pete, it's terrifying. But the Germans have medium trench mortars, but pointed horizontally to shoot at the tanks. These are mortars designed to shoot miles in the air. How in the hell would they aim and fire a trench mortar at a tank? And what sort of nerve would you need to hold the ground as the tanks rumble down on you? So I think that's the thing we come to time and time again, is given the complicated arrangements here and the collaboration between all the arms, the Germans had simply no answer.
Yeah, I mean, the German guns, those that are left and are able to fire, they only open fire 5 minutes after 0 hour. And by that time, they're across no man's land. It's too bloody late. The lessons have been learned from previous battles. The infantry, the Canadians, the Australians, the British, they know they've got to keep in touch with the tanks and the creeping barrage. And the reason they have to do that is if they don't, the Germans will emerge from their dugouts and set up their machine guns. But if you keep close, this is what we said, almost within the last shells of the barrage, then you get them. And the Germans are just shell-shocked. They just don't know what they're doing. And to illustrate this, you've got a quote, Private Geoffrey Rose of the 30th Australian Battalion.
He had to say, "We knew that we had to follow our tanks, so kept along after them. Every now and then, Fritzes would come running back with their hands up, well souvenired, watches and pocketbooks all gone. One Hun came suddenly inside of a tank that I was near. He was so scared that he bounded right at me and would have knocked me down. But I poked the old bayonet at him and he steadied up. Their main idea seemed to be to get taken prisoner and to get out of the line at the earliest." And that's what we touched on before. What's it like being a German with no answer? These thunderous beasts, hundreds of them, coming out of the mist, blasting away with cannons and machine guns. What are you going to do? What would I do? I put my hands up as quick as I could.
Well, and possibly in 1916, but even then, these new tactics are too much for them. The tanks get through to their second objectives, and here's a quote from Captain Smedle, great name, of the 15th Battalion Tank Corps, and he gets one of the finest target opportunities he ever encountered in the Great War. And this is what he says: "The enemy were evidently quite unaware of the rapidity of our advance, for just as we were about opposite Harbonnière, we saw an ammunition train steaming into the station as if nothing was the matter. It was immediately shelled by all the 6-pounder guns of the approaching tanks. One must have struck a powder van, for suddenly the whole train burst into one great sheet of flame, reaching to a height of not less than 150 feet. Needless to say, that train was stopped. It was followed by another, a passenger train, rushing up fresh troops. This was running on another rail and ran right into our lines. It was captured complete with personnel." This is a sign of the confusion. The Germans shouldn't have been running trains forward under fire like this. But they're confused. They don't know what's happening. The people on the train don't know what's happening. Nobody knows what's happening.
And when you're talking advances that are measured in thousands of yards, I'm not surprised. You know, these areas for months had been safely behind the lines, and now all of a sudden you've got enemy tanks closing in on you. I'm not surprised there was confusion.
I want to make a point which isn't in our notes, which I can't remember whether it's true or not. But you know that big bangy thing, the huge gun outside the Australian War Memorial,
the Army-on gun, yes.
Yeah, which you lot say was captured by you lot. The cavalry always say they captured it, and then it was stolen from them by the Australian infantry.
I believe that's the case. I actually do believe that's the case, that a British cavalry unit closed in on it, and an aircraft came over the top and strafed it, and so all the gunners ran away, as you would do, and then the cavalry moved on.
That gun is no good for close quarter combat.
You can't fire over open sights, the Army-on gun, but it's a huge, massive rail gun. But then, yes, the cavalry moved on to their next objective, and the Aussies turned up and claimed it. But the point is,
the cavalry are playing a part. People forget the cavalry, but they are there and they are doing it. And I always like to remind people of that. The cavalry are there. Are they important? Not as important as other things, but they are still playing a role. Now, what's it like in one of those tanks, Matt? What is it like? What's it like?
God, it must have been absolute hell. Anyone that thinks these tanks are anything except rudimentary, better think again, because they were awful. And I've got a quote here from Private Charles Rowland of the 14th Battalion Tank Corps. He's a British fellow. Just describing what it was like in the tanks. And I should also say, Pete, the tanks had actually come a long way since 1916, since they'd first been used. This is an advanced version of the tank. But here's what he had to say about being in a tank. It was like Dante's Inferno in the bus. You could hardly put a foot down for spent shell cases, cartridge cases, and could hardly breathe for the fumes of the engine, which was red hot by now. Steam from the boiling water, and even the oil in the return tank was boiling over. Sweat was pouring out of us, and we kept having a swig of water out of a petrol tin when there was a chance, and the cordite fumes from the 6-pounders was nearly choking us, but we could do nothing about it.
And it made some of them ill. The tanks are in some ways a one-use weapon. The crews, they have to have spare crews because they're finished. I mean, I can't imagine what it was like. Now, I want to say this. There wasn't success everywhere. I think the Canadians and Australian Corps, they're just a fantastic success. You can't describe how brilliantly they did. They reach all their objectives along the old Amiens defence line that we mentioned earlier, was the far limit. And They're just doing it's the new tactics. It's the no German artillery really left. The new British tank and infantry, the use of Lewis guns, rifle grenades, Stokes mortars. Whenever there is a German machine gun post or strong point, whatever, it's over the sheer firepower. That firepower the British Army didn't have in 1914 and didn't have in 1916. They do have it now. They are modern infantry. However, and this can cause the more stupid Australian historian, and there aren't many of those these days. That generation have gone, except for rugby playing ones. That generation has gone. I think the British don't do so well. The advance of the Third Corps, they're just north of the Somme. It's part of the same offensive, but you don't hear much about it because they don't do very well. But there's a lot of good reasons. Now, you're Australian.
Yeah, I want to jump in.
Tell me.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say, yes, it is true that the British Third Corps didn't do as well, further north and et cetera, et cetera. But do not think for a second it was because, they're British troops, they didn't know what they were doing, and the Aussies and the Canadians were, just naturally better fighters. I mean, the poor old Brits, in this area, but had a lot of obstacles that the Canadians and the Australians didn't. I mean, these weren't fresh troops by any stretch of the imagination. These were not hand-picked troops that had been husbanded behind the line like the Canadians and the Australians. This was a standard British corps, and they'd already been through the mill, Pete. These are the guys that had faced the German Spring Offensive, and so they were pretty knocked around by the time the offensive even started. That's right. They're lacking. I mean, the result in that is a bit like the Germans. They're beginning to run out of experienced officers and NCOs, and a lot of them are young drafts, straight from home. They've been trained, but they've got no practical experience. Now, there was also bloody Germans. They'd attacked the Third Corps on the 6th of August. That was a bit of a spoiler as well. That didn't bloody help. And the other thing is geography's against them. You've been there. You know, the ground overlooking, the ground between the Somme and the Ancre, it's a plateau cut by gullies and spurs, in effect. And they run there. And that means if you're advancing along north of north of the Somme, I'm not good at north and south, then you have to go across a series of ridges leading down to the Somme. They also have less tanks. There are only 36 out of this massive number of tanks allotted to the British. So this is, to me, it's completely understandable what happens to the Third Corps. It's not that they're not manly enough, that the Australians and Canadians are bigger willies and all more manly and just tougher. It's not that. It's just a variety. They're not as good soldiers, but there are reasons they're not as good, and also the tactical situation is against them. This is something I remember. Things, just before you get to your quote to describe that in detail, Pete, one of the things I did want to focus on there, which I think is vital and easy to overlook, is the role of NCOs, so sergeants and corporals, and their officers. When we talk about the Canadians and the Australians being husbanded and prepared as an attack force, a huge part of that is making sure there's enough NCOs and enough officers, and they know what they're doing, that they're experienced, that they're good leaders of men, that they're well-trained, that they know exactly what their orders are. It's not just that the men are really good, they've got really good leaders as well, and that's easy to overlook. If you've got a unit like the Third Corps, the poor old British Third Corps, that's been through the mill against the Germans, they're not going to have many officers, they're not going to have many experienced sergeants who are going to be able to lead in battle, and that is one of the key ingredients of an infantry advance.
I absolutely agree. And this is what Private Bill Gilmer... Now, I still remember in the mid-80s, interviewing, before you were born, Matt, interviewing him in his back garden in Hornchurch, I think it was, near Hornchurch anywhere. He was a wonderful old boy, in his prime, it seemed, at 88. But he said this. He was a Cockney, but no. If only Gary was here. He speaks it naturally, like a native. He says this. He was in the 2nd London Regiment. We had to attack the ridge. It was a fairly long ridge, unknown to us. There was from 10 to 20 heavy German machine guns in emplacements. My God, he really opened up. He let us have it. He just swept us. I looked around as I was advancing, and you could see the numbers of our people melting away, just dropping all around you. Those that fell were still shot over again. There were no orders, nothing. There was nothing you could do. It was getting so bad, as I took my steps, I thought, the next one will be it. But of course you didn't know what being hit was. I jumped for this big shell hole. Fortunately it was empty, no water in it. I wouldn't have minded if it had. I'd have gone in. I knew there was no hope of getting any orders because there was nobody to give any. The bullets were hitting the back of the shell hole. It was raining bullets. I think that's a great description. It's one of the beauties.
Does it just sum up what we were saying, Pete? It just sums it up. Twice he mentions that. Those who fell were shot all over again. There were no orders, nothing. So again, there's no one to tell him what to do because there's no sergeants or officers. Or not adequate numbers anyway, there was no hope of getting any orders because there was nobody to give any. Again, these units were depleted, so they were short on NCOs and officers to tell the men what to do.
And the ones that were there had been killed or wounded, yeah. Now, I want to say that even in an all-arms battle, Rawlinson's made a mistake here. Not Monash, he's a corps commander. Monash, the 4th Army commander, had made a mistake. They had not allowed for the threats of those the Chillipi Ridge and the other ridges running down to the Somme. And it is a bit of a disaster. However, I say bit of a disaster. The 3rd Corps were held up on their first objectives. That's still an advance of how many yards would you say? Go on, have a guess.
Well, based on our maths from the early orders, 2,500 yards, Pete. That's a hell of an advance by First World War standards.
Yeah, it's not bad at all. However, what about the rest of them? The Battle of Amiens is an incredible success. The 4th Army, in one day, Matt, they advanced some 8 miles on a 10-mile front, and the French conformed to the south. Now, have we mentioned the French? Well, let's just say they're doing everything we're doing. They also, by this time, they're cautious. They advanced slightly in echelon. They let us go slightly first. But they're still playing their part. How are the Germans doing?
Well, it was a huge blow to the Germans. So more than 27,000 casualties in a single day, of which 15,000 were prisoners. It just shows the depth and speed of the advance. They'd lost 400 guns, and by this we mean artillery guns. And as an aside, I'll say to people, if you're in Australia, there's an example of how successful this battle was in just about every suburban park in Australia. Just down the road from where I am, there is a gun captured on the 8th of August. And
wow,
they're everywhere you go. If you see an artillery piece in a park, which is less common than it used to be, but you still see them around, I almost guarantee they were captured on the 8th of August because they just swept forward, and you know something's gone very wrong in your army when you're losing your artillery pieces, which are supposed to be miles behind the line. But
absolutely.
400 artillery guns captured, plus all the mortars and all the machine guns. It was just an absolute disaster for the Germans.
It is. And it is obligatory. It's a bit like when you mention Mel Tepe, you always have to say cone-shaped hill.
Cone-shaped hill.
Cone-shaped hill. Otherwise, you're struck down in your prime. Or a bit late for them, getting me in my prime. But Ludendorff summed it up as August 8th was the black day of the German army in the history of this war. And it is true, I think.
Disaster. An absolute disaster.
And the British, that's the Australians, Canadians and British, they're all part of the British Army, 9,000 only, Matt. Imagine how we'd feel if we had 9,000 casualties. That would be about 3,000 dead, I would imagine. Yeah. Only 9,000 British casualties and relatively light French casualties. I haven't got those.
But there's a really interesting comparison we can make here too, Pete, is that the vast bulk of the German casualties were prisoners. So of the 27,000, 15,000 were prisoners. So that's 12,000. Yeah, so that's 12,000 killed and wounded. The Allied casualties would almost all have been killed and wounded because they didn't lose many men captured. So we're probably talking in real terms 12,000 killed and wounded versus 9,000 killed and wounded. So it was costly for the Allies.
Oh, it's always costly. There's no such thing as... And the Germans are hard... Amongst the Germans, there are still hard fighters. There are still men who will sell their lives for their country. And I've got nothing but admiration for the German army and what they achieve. If you run into a determined German a strong point, you're in a world of trouble if you can't get the tanks or artillery onto it quickly. There is a problem about... So you're looking forward to great day. What about the second day? What's going? We're going to thrust forward with all our tanks and all our guns. Are we?
Yeah, I think there's an issue with the tanks, isn't there, Pete? As we said before, these tanks are not reliable. They're very vulnerable, and the crews, even if the tanks survive, the crews are going to be absolutely exhausted. And so
I'd say half poisoned as well.
Half poisoned. You're right.
Yeah.
Incapacitated, as you said. We need replacement crews. The descriptions of crews coming out of tanks at the end of the day, they're absolutely wrecked. And you've got some stats here about how the tanks fared on this day.
Yeah, they're not really fit for purpose in my view. I mean, they're useful, but they're not efficient weapons. They're single-use weapons. 415 tanks go into action. Yeah, Matt. Only 145 could resume the attack next morning. I would normally ask Gary how many that was. I'm going for
it's a lot.
370 were out of action for one reason or another.
It's extraordinary.
And this is something that happens every day. So the day after, there's the same proportion less until there are hardly any. And this is part of the story. There are problems for the British. If you advance 8 miles, which they did, not the British Army, and not Third Corps, they only went 2,500 yards. But what problems does it mean if you go that far, 8 miles?
Well, we see this in the history of modern warfare. We saw it, with Blitzkrieg in the Second World War. We see it everywhere. We saw it during the German Spring Offensive at the start of 1918, is if the infantry advances that quickly, you're going to outrange your artillery. There's no gun in the world that can fire over the heads of the artillery at that range, and you might be able to move up light guns, but you can't move the heavy guns up quickly, which were essential to the advance the day before.
And they're heavy. They're not something you can just go, I'll move that forward. It's going to take a while.
And don't forget the Germans who are being pushed back. I know we talked about a lot of artillery pieces being taken, but they were mostly the field guns close to the front line. The heavy German guns, when they realised there was a big breakthrough, they were able to be pulled back, and they are still in range of the infantry. The Germans haven't outranged their guns. They still have a lot of artillery in play.
Now, the other thing is logistics. It's whenever you advance this far, there's a bloody problem because you've got 8 miles of devastation, a new front line, and you've got to bring everything you need, all the ammunition, all the fuel, the food, the water, anything you bloody well need. It's got to be got forward, and
it's got to be got forward over a battlefield. Not because you've just spent all day fighting over this ground. It's not smooth farm fields. This has been devastated by the action of the previous day.
And the other thing is, nobody knows where anything is. Where are the headquarters of the 5th Australian Battalion? I don't know where they were there. Sorry, but where's the headquarters? Where's the brigade headquarters? Where are the guns? What's happening? Where are the tank support? They're all broken down over there, sir. Oh. There's a tremendous dislocation in command. The Germans, they're falling back. Their reinforcements start to move forward. So the Allied numerical superiority is going to drift away, and British units are going to get tired. Even Australians, Matt, get tired at times.
The 9th of August, Pete, this isn't in the notes, but the 9th of August was heralded by Australians as a pretty poor effort by the Australians. And Monash came under a lot of flack for what happened on the 9th of August. And I think it was Charles Bean in the official history who actually said everyone seemed so busy congratulating each other on the success of the 8th of August that they didn't make any preparations for the 9th. And the 9th was a bit of a stuff-up as far as the Australians were concerned.
Yeah, and each day they do carry on advancing. It was a relative failure, the 9th, but 10th. But by 11th of August, there's no two ways about it. They're not gaining new ground. And the Germans start to stabilise the front. One reason is because they fall back into the Somme trenches. The Battle of the Somme 1916 trenches. So they've got existing defence works.
Which were a lot tougher than the flimsy positions they'd been occupying at the start of the battle.
Now, here is something that is important, and it's the next... You've got the all-arms battle, but there's something else. When you have a battle, do you keep bashing away at the same point in the line? Bash, bash, biffity, bash, 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 bash. Well, the answer will become apparent in our conversation because the front is stabilising. The Germans, you're going to lose more and more casualties if you keep on attacking there in front of Amiens.
The other thing about that, Pete, of course, is the Germans now know where that attack has been, and so they're sending reinforcements to that part of the line. So at the start of the day, the Germans didn't know that an attack was coming, but by the end of the day, they certainly do. So they're bringing reinforcements into those positions where there's been a breakthrough. So now, here, 2 men play a real role. And there, I want to pay tribute to both of them. Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie, commanding the Canadian Corps, and Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, obviously the Australian Corps. They're doing brilliantly. The odd fluctuation, the 9th, but they're doing well. But they
see that they're going to be battering their heads against a brick wall if they carry on, that they are going to. All the successes will be frittered away by massive, massive casualties if they carry on battering their heads. And they want time to reorganise, amass their forces and prepare for a proper planned attack at the next time. They want to look, for a start, there's new German batteries coming into line. Where are they? Where are they, Matt? Well, we don't know. Because they're new.
And again, we've got to come back to these points that one of the keys to success on the 8th of August was preparation, planning, identifying those batteries, knowing what troops are opposite you, knowing how many troops are opposit you. And you're absolutely right, Pete. If they just rushed into another attack straight away, they would just be throwing away all these advantages that they took, that they'd learnt with at such great cost.
And they've been attacking now for what, 3 days? 3 days solid fighting. Now, those two corps commanders persuade General Sir Henry Rawlinson commanding 4th Army, but they're not in overall charge. Who is in charge? Well, Haig gets involved. Now, Haig is at first inclined to tell them to get on with it, but then they persuade him. And this is the thing. Is Haig inflexible? Well, he can be, but he certainly on this occasion says, yeah, you're right. 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 He didn't say it like that. But he did say...
He said it with a Scottish accent, yeah.
Actually, he was from Edinburgh, so I doubt if he had a Scottish accent in English. Now, but there's somebody else involved. Foch, or Foch, as you would say. Foch was involved, and he wants to drive them forward. And at first, Haig sort of goes along with it. He wants only a short pause, but his subordinates have changed his mind. And this is the final piece of the tactics, because this is when what they have to learn is when to stop attacking, when to change the focus of the attack, and at the same time prepare for the next assault on the same ground so that you're ready. And Haig meets Foch, and it's a tremendous climactic battle. If you read Foch's account, it's basically Haig told me, and I said, oh, okay, but you'll have to attack with 3rd Army next to it, i.e. North of the Somme. In Haig's account, it's a thrilling encounter. with Foch being told what, but basically, of course, the British Army is not under Foch's command. Foch has, he's Commander-in-Chief by consent. So they're going to attack with the 3rd Army just to the north, instead of the 4th Army battering its way through these, And now that, I think that's still falling in with Foch's greater agenda. How so?
Well, Foch, we had to batter against the Germans, but it didn't just have to be the one place. I mean, the idea was let's attack the Germans all along the line. Let's keep them forever guessing where the next attack is coming and keep them on their toes.
That's it. And this would be the pattern of the real 100 days, or the British 100 days. We've acknowledged that the French started off, and basically we'll deal with this a lot next. But it culminates in 4 battles in 4 days, where basically the British hit them. British, Americans and French hit them 4 times in 4 days at different sectors of the line. Why can they do that? Because there's enough guns now. Every army has enough guns to launch a major offensive. Every army has the supplies, the ammunition. This is not 1916 where you have to spend months preparing. They're all ready up and down the line. And this is what this is going to be the rest of the war. But there's one thing about war that's always the same. And that's the dead. They have to be buried. And I've got a quote here that sort of is quite nice about the Australians. And it's been, in some ways, it's been a podcast that reflects on British, Australian, Canadian successes and French. But let's bring a sort of human touch to it, and then let's ruin it by having a bit of doggerel. So here we are. This is what Second Lieutenant John Fleming, who's U Battery, Royal Horse Artillery, says. Some of the graves dotting a battlefield had inscriptions, often macabre, as in the case of one I saw, that of a German killed during an Australian advance. To the man's rifle had been pinned a sheet of cardboard on which was scrawled in chalk. And this is what was scrawled in chalk by a small child.
I can hear a small child in the background.
So go on.
Don't worry about that. Here is what was written on this, it's scrawled in chalk on a piece of cardboard. Here you lie, brother Bosch. Your pals won't bury you. Hindenburg won't bury you. Your Kaiser won't bury you. They can't. But the poor bloody Aussie will bury you because you stink.
I don't know. It's the brutal reality of war in 1918, isn't it? I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Pete, we can talk tactics and armies and generals and the whole thing, but at the end of the day, it's that poor bloke in the front line and some poor German who faced this massive onslaught, reduced to that poor pile of humanity right there. So, I mean, I think it's a fitting way to end, to remember those poor blokes that had to face this terrible ordeal. It's war is never pretty, is it?
No.
Mate, it's been great. The first of our series of podcasts. I think we're doing 4 episodes in total. What a great way to kick it off. And as always, Pete, I mean, you interviewed some of these people. These words are on this page because you spoke to them. I mean, it's quite extraordinary to have you here telling this story, mate. And I'm just so grateful. I can't wait for next week, Pete. So thank you very much, mate.
Looking forward to it. Cheers, Matt.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.
Hey, it's Mark Maron from WTF, here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.